Hello my friends, welcome to day 2 of the 20-day flower creation journey, a foundation to watercolor floral painting. Today we are going to paint a delphinium, taking inspiration from the flower color guidebook. And as you can see, all the flowers are around a long stem, they are in round shape and fluffy. Let's start painting. So in order to create these flowers, I decided to use a filbert brush, which is, in this case, a Princeton Select filbert brush in size 8. I mix a little bit of magenta and ultramarine violet, and I started to create the first flowers by pressing the filbert brush onto the paper with the magenta mixture and releasing the pressure going from the external part of the flower to the center part of the flower. I basically try to create little petals that are going around the center part of the flower that I will create in a second stage. The plant of delphinium has many of these fluffy flowers all around the stem, so I keep in mind to have some space in the center to create later the stem that goes from the bottom of this page up to the top. I keep creating these flowers in a round shape using the belly of my brush and the side of my brush to create these fluffy petals. In order to give the impression that these flowers are light, I keep changing the color value of the magenta I have on my brush. To do this, I remove part of the pigment into my cup of water and I create petals that are lighter in value. I started from the bottom of this plant and I'm keeping in mind to have quite a triangular shape. This means that the bottom part of this plant is going to have more flowers, and going up towards the top of my paper, I will have smaller petals, smaller buds of these flowers, and I will end up creating small petals just by touching lightly the paper with my brush. In this moment, for example, I'm adding a little bit more flowers and petals in the center part of the plant, and I'm trying to create this triangular shape going up towards the top of the paper and towards the top of the plant, adding very tiny brush strokes that resemble the buds indeed. I'm really just touching and putting a little bit of pressure onto the paper, and I'm taking care to change the color on my brush to give some movement to the whole composition. At this point, I'm just adding a little bit of details, a little bit of more petals toward the bottom in order to create a shape that is more homogeneous onto the paper. In this case, this plant has a lot of flowers of round shape, and in order to create something that is nice to look at, I take care to create these petals and overall these flowers using a magenta color, but also all of its different shades and different values, color values, by removing some of the pigment into the cup of water and using values that are lighter, that are more watery and less concentrated in pigment. I mix sometimes a little bit of magenta with a little bit of purple as well. The purple I'm using is ultramarine violet, and I create a color that I like to see and is quite similar to what I see on the picture. I add some contrast using the ultramarine violet, and also in this case I'm reaching the top of the second plant of delphinium, therefore I'm starting to creating smaller buds by pressing on paper the side of my filbert brush, which is pretty small in size, and I create these petals and buds towards the top. As you can see, I'm trying to reach a nice composition by using different color mixture of this magenta. Sometimes it's pure magenta and sometimes is a magenta mixture with a little bit of violet, and the color values are quite different. Sometimes the magenta is very concentrated and sometimes it's not. At this point, I take my mop brush, and I like to use it because the point is very fine. I take a little bit of yellow and I touch the center of the flowers to start to create the center part in yellow. The yellow I'm using is a mixture of yellow lemon dip and yellow ochre. And I follow my reference picture to understand where to place the center of these flowers. I keep in mind that in the center part of the whole plant there will be a stem, so I understand where to put the center of the flower because these flowers are sort of hanging from the center part of the delphinium stem. To create these center parts, I'm being very light and I'm using just the tip of the brush. You can also use a round brush to do this. In fact, I take my round brush in size 6 to start creating the stem of these flowers. And I use a dark green to start with this process. I mix a little bit of sub-green and a little bit of green earth, and I create this stem in the center part of the flower, looking at my reference picture, but also looking where my flowers should be hanging from. I'm being very light and using just the tip of my brush to create the stem. I add a little bit of contrast by mixing brown, this is burnt umber, to the green mixture that I've just applied onto paper. And I keep adding a few strokes to show where the stem is and where the flowers are hanging from. I do the same now with the second delphinium, and with a mixture of green, of dark green, I create a stem in the center part of this plant, and I look where the stem should be placed, following the shape of the flowers I've created and understanding where these flowers should be hanging from. The delphinium plant doesn't have so many leaves, so I keep this in mind. So now, following my reference picture, I use the same brush, a round brush in size 6, to create these few leaves that I see on the reference picture. These are leaves in a triangular shape with, let's say, 3 main parts. And this is what I'm trying to recreate by pressing my round brush onto paper and leaving a pointy tip at the end of the leaf. As I understand that the delphinium doesn't have so many leaves, I do not add more of them onto this representation, but I just keep a few leaves sparse, and especially in the bottom part of this composition. I take back my filbert brush and I create a mixture on my palette of magenta and violet, and with this brush I start to create additional strokes in a much concentrated color, and I basically add more flowers towards the bottom of the second delphinium. I do this at this stage because I understand, having a look, that the lower part is lacking a few flowers and petals. So this is one recommendation that I can give you and one tip. You can start creating the overall shape of your flowers, but you don't have to be precise in first place. You can always go back and add a few details at a second stage. Here, for example, I'm adding more flowers in the bottom part of the first Delphinium because I have the feeling that something is missing, and to make this whole composition complete, I wanted to have more color and more petals in this area. I take my round brush and I start to create some stems that connect to these flowers that I've just created. I'm basically refining the composition that I've created. With the mop brush, I also add the center part of these flowers that I haven't created in first place. I take now the filbert brush and with a mixture of magenta, I start to add a few strokes on top of the petals that I've already created to give movement. I created these brush strokes basically by using the side of my brush when I want to have some fine lines and the belly of my brush when I want thicker brush strokes. I add to the mixture a little bit of ultramarine violet to have different colors laid onto paper to create a very fun composition to look at. I usually like to add these contrasting strokes toward the end of my composition because I have an overall look of what I have created and I can understand better where to place these brush strokes. And this is indeed the end of our composition. I really hope you enjoyed painting with me and I hope to see you on day 3.